The most common comment on every Princess Margaret video is some variation of this: "She was Andrew before Andrew." It surfaces independently on different platforms across different years. Different accounts, different audiences arriving at the same conclusion without consulting each other. Published analyses have noted the same thing. Gyles Brandreth's account of the modern royal family groups both figures in the same unflattering context, and Tom Quinn's "Yes, Ma'am, The Secret Life of Royal Servants" treats them as comparable specimens from the documented staff experience. The instinct has a documentable basis. The behavioral record, when you actually go through it, civil list debates recorded in Hansard, staff accounts preserved in memoirs, palace statements preserved in BBC archives, court filings preserved in the Southern District of New York, produces something more striking than a resemblance. It produces a blueprint. One substantive acknowledgement first, because this comparison has a 40-year contextual gap that would be dishonest to paper over. Princess Margaret's defining scandal involved Roddy Llewellyn, a consenting adult 25 years old when they met, in a relationship that lasted approximately 8 years. Prince Andrew faced a civil lawsuit from Virginia Giuffre, alleging sexual conduct involving a 17-year-old, which he consistently denied, settled out of court in February 2022 for an undisclosed sum that the Daily Telegraph reported to exceed £12 million. Those aren't equivalent situations. Margaret operated in an era of institutional press deference that was fraying through the 1970s, but not yet broken. Andrew sat opposite Emily Maitlis in the era of social media, real-time fact-checking, and clips that circulate permanently. Margaret died in February 2002. The internet was barely in the business of ensuring nothing disappears. By November 2019, when Andrew generated his most catastrophic headlines, the internet had been doing that business efficiently for 2 decades. Those differences are genuine and substantive. The reason the audience comparison keeps appearing isn't that the scandals were identical in kind. The institution's response to both was structurally identical, despite the scandals differing in kind. Years of private management, public silence through accumulating damage, reactive distancing triggered only when external pressure made neutrality untenable, and an exile in place that preserved the physical infrastructure of royal life while emptying it of formal content. That pattern, not the individuals, not the specific misconduct, is what the evidence documents. In April 1978, The Washington Post ran a headline that Buckingham Palace had done nothing to prevent. Princess Margaret keeps pay, privileges, despite a royal affair. She had spent the previous 2 years generating some of the most damaging tabloid coverage the modern royal family had seen. Photographs of her and Llewellyn on Mustique had run in the news of the world in February 1976. A formal separation from Lord Snowdon had been announced, all 39 words of it, in March 1976. Parliamentary critics were demanding she appear before a select committee to justify her income. And yet, in April 1978, the Washington Post headline was still necessary because she kept every penny. The Hansard record is specific on the money. In February 1980, Princess Margaret's civil list allowance stood at £35,000 per year, roughly £170,000 in today's terms. Parliament voted to increase it to £82,000 for 1980 to 1981. By 1984, a formal civil list order, preserved in full in the legislation archive, bumped the provision to £107,100. By 1988, the Hansard record shows the figure rising again to £127,000, then £132,100. A 1984 UPI survey put Margaret's dollar equivalent at $169,650 annually. below Princess Anne's $174,300, but well above what Princess Diana or Prince Charles received from the civil list in the same year, which was nothing at all. These weren't secret transfers. They were voted figures, debated in the Commons, recorded for permanent reference. Parliament knew exactly what it was approving and chose, on each occasion, to continue. What the public received in exchange was a diminishing return. Time magazine, in its April 1978 London dispatch, documented the gap between what Margaret was paid and what the public received. The Sunday News of the World posed the commercial logic of this directly to its readers. Do you think Princess Margaret gives us value for our money? 3 out of 4 answered no. Labour MP Willie Hamilton, whom Time described as the Commons' most vigorous monarchy baiter, saw the proposed civil list increase and said publicly, "If any of the increase goes to Margaret, there will be nationwide outrage." It went to Margaret. The outrage, as documented across the British press of that spring, was nationwide. The allowance continued for another 2 decades, through all of it. Cross the decades to Prince Andrew. His most resonant nickname, Air Miles Andy, wasn't invented by hostile commentators. It was earned from documented expense claims attached to his role as UK Special Representative for International Trade and Investment, a position he held from 2001. The Daily Telegraph reported in March 2011 that Andrew had spent £620,000 on travel and expenses in 2010 alone. He had left the Royal Navy in 2001 with a pension of £20,000 per year. The arithmetic of his lifestyle required a public subsidy the trade envoy role conveniently provided. When that role was terminated in July 2011, quietly, without press conference, without formal public explanation, the financial infrastructure didn't dissolve with it. It became less legible. A Guardian investigation published in 2023 found Andrew had received nearly £13 million in public funds to support his royal work over 4 decades. His Royal Lodge residence in Windsor operates under a 75-year lease he took out in 2003, structured as £8.5 million up front, covering renovations and advance rent, with a notional annual rent of £260,000 thereafter. The Crown Estate owns the property. He can't sell it. UK property experts cited in press coverage of the ongoing dispute over the house put routine maintenance at approximately £150,000 per year. His private security costs after removal from public duties have been estimated by multiple outlets at between £3 and £6 million annually, a figure his £20,000 naval pension can't begin to address. King Charles III reportedly cut off Andrew's private annual allowance after the January 2022 title changes. What remained was a pension, a lease he can't exit, and a security bill of a size that makes his financial dependency on the institution structural rather than incidental. Margaret kept her Kensington Palace apartment, her allowance, her title, and her staff until she died. Andrew's January 2022 removal of military affiliations and HRH style use was unprecedented in the modern royal era for a living family member. The formal process to strip his Prince designation was reportedly initiated by King Charles III in the years that followed. Both trajectories follow the same basic geometry. The financial and residential infrastructure of royal entitlement persisting long past public justification, dismantled only under sustained external force, never proactively. Peter Russell spent 14 years in the British royal household, from 1954 to 1968. His summary of Princess Margaret as an employer, a nightmare to work for, has been cited so often that its edges have worn smooth. The specific incidents underneath it remain sharp. Tom Quinn's Yes Ma'am, The Secret Life of Royal Servants records two that capture the household dynamic precisely. Paul Burrell, later known as Diana's butler, described Margaret arriving in a room and pressing her hand against the television screen. She was checking whether the set was warm. A warm screen meant staff had been watching it during her absence. This wasn't an occasional suspicion-prompted check. It was a routine performed as a matter of course on arrival, the domestic equivalent of an inspection. What the routine produced in the household, as a permanent condition of employment, was a calibration of behavior around the possibility of being tested at any moment. A household in which the principal's preferences and surveillance extended into space and time she wasn't occupying. A second account from the same source, attributed to a former Kensington Palace maid, is more direct. She had been instructed not to look directly at Margaret, not to speak unless spoken to, and when Margaret passed in a corridor, to step aside with her eyes lowered. The instruction covered what to do with your face and your body in the presence of a person you worked for daily. Not if she passed, when she passed. Craig Brown's 2017 biography, Ma'am Darling, 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret, assembled its portrait from approximately 99 vignettes contributed by people who had passed through Margaret's orbit. Friends, household staff, acquaintances who'd been in the room once when something happened. Brown's method, as the Guardian Review described it, drew on essays, lists, catalogs, diaries, palace announcements, newspaper cuttings, and interviews, as well as parodies. The resulting picture isn't a biography in the conventional sense. It's the accumulated texture of proximity to a particular kind of power. A Vogue review of the book extracted one passage that serves as a representative specimen of the household's social physics. Dinners with Margaret seem to have been Boonwellian tortures. Royal protocol determined that guests couldn't leave before she did, and if she was having a good time, that could mean carrying on until 3 or 4 in the morning. The operative word is could, not would, every night. But the capacity to hold a full table of people through midnight and past it, simply because leaving before she chose to leave was a breach of protocol, was absolute and permanent, and exercised whenever she felt like it. No one at the table could do anything about it. That was the nature of the arrangement everyone at the table had accepted by being there. Lady Anne Glenconner, who served as Margaret's lady-in-waiting for decades, described Margaret in Granta as the best friend I ever had. Her 2019 memoir, Lady in Waiting, is written with genuine affection. She isn't attempting retrospective revenge on someone she clearly loved. A fragment of the memoir that is circulated in secondary accounts records her writing about being treated by Margaret as fairly all right with my sister, but really cruel to me. The sentence breaks off in available accounts. The full context isn't accessible from current sources. But what is accessible is the structural fact of the relationship itself, decades of total deference in the formal role of lady-in-waiting to someone who held total social authority. The role requires absorbing whatever comes from the principal without complaint, for as long as the relationship lasts. Glenconner did that for 30-plus years. That she loved Margaret throughout isn't evidence the relationship was uncomplicated. It's evidence of what sustained deference of that duration actually looks like from inside it. When Margaret died in February 2002, the royal family cleared her household efficiently. The Independent reported in 2014 that departure packages for dismissed staff don't take into account their years in royal service before joining her household, meaning the years that predated her specific employment weren't counted in calculating what staff were owed. Staff expressed anger. The institutional position was that their service to Margaret ended when Margaret did. For Prince Andrew, the documented staff record is genuinely thinner, and saying so is part of accurate reporting rather than a concession to palace PR. Two royal lives, structurally similar, but one with a denser memoir trail, partly because the people around Margaret were further from the legal and reputational consequences that make current royal staff reluctant to speak. What exists for Andrew is fragmentary. Post-2022 reporting described remaining household staff instructed to continue addressing Andrew as Sir after the formal removal of his titles, an instruction sourced to staff and reported across multiple outlets. Andrew Lowney's unauthorized biography, entitled, cited allegations of bullying behavior and what the book characterized as a pattern of humiliating people, though these carry varying levels of attribution and are harder to pin to specific incidents than the Margaret material. The picture Sam McAllister's memoir and subsequent interviews paint of the pre-Newsnight negotiations is, in its way, more diagnostic than any single anecdote. McAllister had spent 6 months negotiating access to Andrew, a former criminal defense barrister who described herself as someone without standard deference when dealing with powerful people. She arrived at Buckingham Palace expecting layers of institutional protection, lawyers at minimum, palace communications officials with authority to say no. She found almost none. No lawyer was present during the hours-long negotiations. Andrew brought his daughter, Princess Beatrice. Beatrice was thoughtful, took notes, asked practical questions. She was clearly there because she believed in her father and wanted to help him, which isn't the same as having the institutional standing to stop what was about to go wrong. On September 3, 1973, Anne Tennant, the woman who published her memoir 36 years later as Lady Glenconner, introduced Princess Margaret to Roddy Llewellyn at a party in Edinburgh. The Café Royal, Edinburgh. Margaret was 43. Llewellyn was 25, the son of Lieutenant Colonel Harry Llewellyn, who had won Olympic gold in show jumping at the 1952 Helsinki Games. He worked as a landscape gardener. For 3 years, the palace said nothing publicly. Margaret and Llewellyn made repeated trips to Mustique, where she owned a villa called Les Jolies Hauts, on land given to her in 1960 as a wedding gift by Colin Tennant, the man Anne Tennant had married, who later became Lord Glenconner. The trips weren't secret. The relationship wasn't invisible to those around the palace. The Queen privately disapproved, according to Christopher Warwick, Margaret's authorized biographer, who recorded the Queen's view that Margaret was behaving badly. The Queen also reportedly told her sister that, "Your happiness is the most important thing." Both positions were maintained simultaneously. Publicly, the institution said nothing. On February 1, 1976, a photographer named Anwar Hussain took photographs of Margaret and Llewellyn swimming together on Mustique. The News of the World published them that same month. The Guardian, in a retrospective published in 2002, described the publication as generating unprecedented press coverage of the private life of a member of the royal family. What the photographs provided that previous reporting had not was visual confirmation, something that could be shown rather than inferred, that placed the relationship on the front page in a form newspapers could print and readers could see. The palace's response came 6 weeks later, on March 19, 1976. Kensington Palace issued a statement. The BBC's archive preserved its complete text. HRH, the Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, and the Earl of Snowdon have mutually agreed to live apart. The princess will carry out her public duties and functions unaccompanied by Lord Snowdon. There are no plans for divorce proceedings. 39 words. Nothing in those 39 words addressed Margaret's conduct. Nothing named Llewellyn. Nothing expressed moral judgment of any kind. The statement confirmed that 2 people had agreed to live apart and that the princess would attend her engagement solo. Logistics, cleanly stated. Nothing else. The apology came from Llewellyn. He issued a public statement expressing regret for any embarrassment caused to Her Majesty and the royal family, and asking to be permitted by the media, who have besieged us, to carry on with our work and private lives without further interference. A 25-year-old landscape gardener who had done nothing illegal apologized to an ancient institution for having embarrassed it. The institution itself offered no moral response to what had embarrassed it. Politicians filled the silence. Hamilton demanded parliamentary accountability. The Bishop of Truro said personal conduct came with the job, then walked it back under clerical pressure. The palace stayed quiet and kept Margaret's allowance current. By April 1978, Time reported that sources close to the crown indicated Margaret had decided to retain her royal duties and her royal income, and that chances were she wouldn't end things with Llewellyn. The answer was no. The relationship continued until the early 1980s. The divorce from Snowdon was finalized on May 24, 1978. Move forward 43 years. Buckingham Palace, November 14, 2019. A room that the royal household staff used afterward for cinema evenings. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, had been talking with BBC Newsnight for approximately 6 months by this point, the length of time producer Sam McAllister had spent negotiating access, first through Andrew's private secretary, Amanda Thirsk, then in person with Andrew himself, with Princess Beatrice taking notes beside her father. The interview was recorded on November 14th and broadcast on November 16th, 2019. Andrew had known Jeffrey Epstein since 1999, when they met through Ghislaine Maxwell. He told Mateless he saw Epstein once or twice a year, perhaps maybe maximum of 3 times a year. He had been to Epstein's homes in Palm Beach, New York, and on the private island of Little St. James. He had traveled on Epstein's private plane. He had brought Epstein to Windsor Castle and to a shooting weekend at Sandringham. In July 2006, 4 months after a Palm Beach police arrest warrant had been issued for Epstein for sexual assault of a minor, Andrew invited Epstein to Princess Beatrice's 18th birthday party at Windsor Castle. When Mateless raised the December 2010 Central Park photographs, Andrew walking with Epstein 5 months after Epstein's release from prison on sex offense convictions, Andrew had an explanation ready. He had gone to New York specifically to end the friendship. Face to face, not by telephone. Doing it over the telephone was the chicken's way of doing it, he told her. He had stayed in Epstein's Manhattan mansion for several days because it was a convenient place to stay. He had attended a dinner at which he was listed as a guest of honor because there were only 8 or 10 of us, I think, at the dinner. When Mateless pressed on why that constituted an appropriate setting for ending a friendship with a convicted sex offender, I admit fully that my judgment was probably colored by my tendency to be too honorable, but that's just the way it is. The alibi for March 10, 2001, the date Virginia Giuffre alleged Andrew had been at Tramp nightclub with her, was specific. He had taken Princess Beatrice to a Pizza Express in Woking for a party at, I suppose, sort of 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Why did he remember this particular day? Because going to Pizza Express in Woking is an unusual thing for me to do. A very unusual thing for me to do. I've only been to Woking a couple of times, and I remember it weirdly distinctly. On the sweating. Virginia Giuffre had alleged Andrew was sweating profusely when she danced with him at Tramp. Andrew told Mateless this was medically impossible. I have a peculiar medical condition, which is that I don't sweat, or I didn't sweat at the time. I had suffered what I would describe as an overdose of adrenaline in the Falklands War when I was shot at, and it was almost impossible for me to sweat. He added that he was starting to be able to do that again, due to unspecified recent activities. Several doctors contacted by the Times of London after the broadcast said this wasn't medically credible. When filming ended, Andrew gave Mateless a tour of Buckingham Palace. He thought it had gone well. McAllister, watching from the room, later described knowing in real time what she had. Whatever they did in terms of rehearsal, that was all out of the window the second he started speaking. With Prince Andrew, everything that could be done badly he keeps doing, and it just gets worse as he goes along. 1.7 million people watched the broadcast on November 16th. The Guardian characterized it as a grotesque mismatch between the Duke of York's language and demeanor, and the gravity of the allegations which continue to surround him. MP Hannah Bardell called it sickening, and said Andrew literally has no remorse or regard for the women abused. KPMG announced it wouldn't renew its sponsorship of Andrew's Pitch at Palace entrepreneurial scheme within days of the broadcast. Standard Chartered followed. The University of Huddersfield accepted Andrew's resignation as chancellor. On November 20th, 2019, 4 days after broadcast, Buckingham Palace announced Andrew was suspending his public duties for the foreseeable future. Over the following weeks, he stepped down from all 230 of his patronages. Virginia Giuffre filed her civil complaint against Andrew on August 9, 2021, in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, case number 1:21-CV-06702, alleging battery and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Andrew's legal team attempted to have the case dismissed on multiple grounds. The efforts failed. A settlement was reached February 15, 2022. Andrew's formal statement said he regrets his association with Epstein and commends the bravery of Ms. Giuffre and other survivors in standing up for themselves and others. The case was dismissed by stipulation in March 2022. The Daily Telegraph, which first reported the settlement's financial terms, put the total above £12 million, approximately £10 million to Giuffre personally, and £2 million to her charitable foundation. The settlement carried no admission of liability. What the palace never issued, at any point between Epstein's arrest in July 2019 and the civil settlement in February 2022, was a moral condemnation of Andrew's conduct. It issued procedural statements confirming the suspension of duties, the return of military affiliations, and the removal of HRH use from official contexts. Its November 2019 statement noted Andrew sympathized with the victims of Epstein, a statement that is about others. The same rhetorical architecture the palace had used in 1976, acknowledge the procedural fact, decline the moral question, was available and was deployed. Margaret's public standing shifted from romantic tragedy to expensive liability across the mid-1970s, with the Mystique photographs completing a process that the Murdoch acquisition of The Sun in 1969 had been enabling. Contemporary accounts of Murdoch's editorial direction to his editors at The Sun and the News of the World document the instruction explicitly. Stop treating royals as gods. Start treating them as people who sell newspapers. The institutional deference that had protected royals from serious investigative coverage through the 1950s and 1960s was commercially undermined by the tabloid shift. By 1976, the Mystique photographs could run precisely because the environment that would previously have suppressed them had changed. By April 1978, the range of available sympathetic framing for Margaret had narrowed to the point where Peregrine Worsthorne of the Daily Telegraph, describing himself as a monarchist defending her against critics, could produce this. Admittedly, Roddy Llewellyn is no Essex or Walter Raleigh, but then she herself is no virgin queen. That line, offered in her defense, is the most accurate temperature reading available. If monarchist sympathy in April 1978 could produce nothing warmer than this, the range of available positions had contracted considerably. 3/4 of Sunday News of the World readers said she provided no value for money. Willie Hamilton wanted her before a select committee. Margaret retained the allowance, the residence, the title, and the relationship, and continued. Her health failed through strokes in 1998 and further illness in 2001. She died on February 9, 2002, at King Edward VII's Hospital. She was 71. The obituaries were respectful and not particularly warm. The institution closed her affairs. Andrew's fall from Falklands hero to post-Newsnight liability happened at the accelerated pace the internet made possible. He had returned from the 1982 Falklands campaign as a helicopter pilot, with a documented record of operational service under fire. The British press covered the return accordingly. The reputational shift to Air Miles Andy took 2 decades, the trade envoy years and their accumulated expense documentation. By January 2020, weeks after Newsnight, YouGov polling placed Andrew at the bottom of the royal family's favorability rankings. Newsweek reported that a majority of British citizens believed he should be stripped of his titles and extradited to the United States. The variable explaining the different severity of outcome is the information environment. Margaret's reputation was at its lowest in 1977 and 1978, but there was no permanent digital record in the sense we now understand the term. The News of the World photographs generated a tabloid cycle that lasted weeks and faded at the biological rate of public memory, not because anyone suppressed it, but because the media infrastructure of 1977 didn't have the architecture to keep it permanently accessible and searchable. The people who had thought badly of Margaret in April 1978 still had to actively remember that, rather than being served a reminder by an algorithm. Andrew's Pizza Express alibi and his sweating condition became permanent cultural text within hours of broadcast. A punk rock band released a song in 2022 titled "Prince Andrew is a Sweaty Nonce," referencing both specific interview claims. It reached number 20 in the UK singles chart. Sky News reportedly disabled comments on related posts because the volume of public response was unmanageable. The interview's content had become not just historical record, but active reference material in the culture. Margaret's partial rehabilitation was enabled in part by a media environment that permitted forgetting at human scale. Andrew had no such structural mercy. The institutional response sequence runs 3 phases in both cases. This is the argument the evidence is built to test, so it requires precision. Phase 1. Tolerance through accumulated damage. Margaret and Llewellyn were in a relationship from September 1973. No formal palace statement, no institutional pressure traceable in the public record, for 3 years. The Queen's private disapproval was documented by her authorized biographer, Christopher Warwick. Private disapproval and institutional action are different things. The palace waited. In Andrew's case, his association with Epstein began in 1999. By March 2011, BBC News was reporting a steady stream of criticism from Andrew's continued friendship with a convicted sex offender and public calls for his trade envoy resignation. He had been photographed in Central Park with Epstein in December 2010, 5 months after Epstein's release on sex offense convictions. His trade envoy role was terminated in July 2011 without formal public explanation. That termination was a genuine institutional action, and it should be distinguished clearly from what followed. Nearly 8 years of non-comment as the legal record around Andrew expanded. Virginia Giuffre's allegations appeared in Florida court filings in December 2014. Her formal civil complaint was filed in August 2021. In the gap between those dates, 7 years, Andrew continued as a working royal while the palace issued no substantive statement on the accumulating record. Phase 2. Reactive distancing at the point of maximum external pressure. For Margaret, 39 words, March 19th, 1976. 6 weeks after the photographs. Logistics only. No moral comment. For Andrew, November 20th, 2019. 4 days after broadcast. Suspension for the foreseeable future. The statement's sympathetic content was directed at Epstein's victims, others, rather than at Andrew's conduct. Both statements were issued at the moment continued neutrality had become publicly untenable. Both avoided the moral dimension of what they were responding to. Phase 3. Exile in place. And here the parallel diverges in a way that matters for what it reveals about the institution. The palace never formally stripped Margaret of anything while she lived. Her title, her allowance, her Kensington Palace apartment, and her staff all remained intact through the Llewellyn years and beyond. Her public duties diminished through her final years, but that diminishment is complicated by genuine ill health. Strokes in 1998, further illness in 2001, and conflating health-driven reduction with institutional exile would misrepresent the record. The palace took formally unprecedented action against Andrew. The January 13, 2022 statement from Buckingham Palace, the Duke of York's military titles and royal patronages have been returned to the Queen, had no modern precedent for a living family member. The Guardian noted at the time that the careful language avoided saying Andrew had been stripped of HRH status. Rather, he would no longer use it in official capacities. The distinction between possessing a title and using it was maintained with legal precision. Reportedly, the formal process to remove the Prince designation itself was initiated by King Charles III in the period that followed, leaving Andrew as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. Nothing equivalent was applied to Margaret during the 30 years of adult scandal preceding her death. Two explanations fit this divergence simultaneously. The first is severity. Andrew's situation produced a civil lawsuit in a U.S. federal court, a settlement reportedly exceeding £12 million, and public calls for extradition, a category of consequence Margaret's situation never approached. The second is the information environment, the palace's standard toolkit of time, silence, managed diminishment, and waiting for the press cycle to move on was built for a pre-internet media environment. It worked on Margaret's situation because that environment allowed forgetting. It failed on Andrew's situation because that environment no longer existed. Valentine Lowe's 2022 book, Courtiers, The Hidden Power Behind the Crown, captures the institutional dynamic precisely. Palace aides noting that the king had already used various sanctions in an effort to manage Andrew. Each one applied only after the previous proved insufficient. That sequence, reactive escalation, each sanction triggered by the failure of the one before, is what an institution looks like when it manages a symptom without treating the cause. The cause, in both cases, was a culture inside the institution that treated royal entitlement as a private matter to be accommodated internally, generating formal public action only when external pressure reached the point where accommodation had become untenable. The Queen's role across both cases follows the same architecture. With Margaret, she privately disapproved and privately maintained that her sister's happiness was paramount, holding both positions simultaneously without resolving the tension between them. With Andrew, described across multiple accounts as her favorite child, though she reportedly resisted the characterization, the same structure is visible. Emily Maitlis, speaking in a 2023 Channel 4 documentary, described the sequence after the Newsnight broadcast. It was only on the Saturday, when the Queen had reportedly read the whole transcript, that he received a tap on the shoulder by his security detail. It was after the Queen had seen what the interview contained that I think it dawned on her before it dawned on him. Andrew, having just given mateless a tour of the palace, and apparently still in good spirits, was collected by security after the Queen had finished reading. The January 2022 title removal happened with the Queen's approval and agreement, as Buckingham Palace confirmed. Yet multiple accounts from the same period describe her as personally supportive of Andrew throughout the crisis, close to him, maintaining the relationship, privately present in a way the institution's formal statements weren't. Sam McAllister, completing the final pre-interview negotiations, was told by Andrew that he needed to discuss the decision over a cup of tea with Mum, and the next day came confirmation to proceed. Whether that conversation constituted formal institutional endorsement of the interview is disputed. Mateless maintained she received assurance of the Queen's approval. Palace insiders told the Sunday Telegraph she had not personally signed off. The pattern across both siblings and their relationship to their mother and sister monarch is the same. A sovereign who loved the person, who managed the institution, and who couldn't find a consistent way to make those two things compatible with each other, deferring to the person until external circumstances required deferring to the institution instead. With Margaret, no external circumstances ever forced that choice at the scale that would have required a definitive answer. With Andrew, they did, at scale and in public and on camera, and in an information environment that made the choice permanent. The people who have spent years leaving comments comparing Margaret and Andrew were doing something real. The comparison has a documented basis across the behavioral record. In financial entitlement extracted from the institution over decades, in household cultures built on total deference and limited accountability, in sexual scandal met with palace procedural statements that declined any moral engagement, and in a family that looked away from mounting damage until external pressure forced it to look. Published works had noted the structural similarity without making it the central argument. The audience made it central, independently and repeatedly, before anyone with access to the full documentary record had checked it systematically. The institution didn't learn from Margaret's case. Margaret's case didn't require learning. She died before the consequences became existential. The palace managed her through its standard toolkit: silence, private management, procedural statements, waiting. And the management worked, imperfectly and expensively, well enough. The toolkit was preserved. When the structurally identical situation emerged in a different decade, with a different royal and different alleged conduct in categorically different territory, the institution reached for the same tools. The tools were built before the Internet existed. The Internet had been running at full capacity for 25 years. The gap between those two facts is the story. 50 years apart, different scandals, same entitlement, same cruelty, same family looking the other way. The only difference is that Margaret died before the Internet could finish the story. Andrew wasn't so lucky. If this kind of documented analysis is what you come here for, subscribe. There's more of it.